when I was invited to speak on the topic of re-embodying public policy, I started to think through, well, what do I actually want to say? I only have 45 minutes because to a certain extent, more or less everything when it comes to public policy deals with the body. I wasn't here last night for Bishop Barron's opening talk. I flew in this morning. But my understanding is that he spoke against dualism, and he spoke in favor of a hylomorphic understanding, a body-soul unity of the human person. And so if that is true, and I think it is true, that people are bodies, and if public policy is about people and the flourishing of people, the flourishing of the common good of people, well, then everything with public policy deals with bodies. And that's going to be true whether it's about trade, whether it's taxation. But then you can get more particular. Think about some of our child labor laws. Right? Think about some of our laws dealing with public health, right? Very much more particularized about the body. Think about some of our debates about immigration reform, healthcare reform. But as I was thinking about those debates, what struck me is that the debate doesn't hinge on the nature of the body. The debate hinges on how do we best serve those bodies. Right? So the debate over immigration reform or healthcare reform, it's not primarily about whether or not we should be healing people, whether or not poor people should have access to health care. Presumably, any good faith actor in those debates agrees about the. Right? They disagree about what are the best means. Should we have single-payer health care? Should we have markets in health care? Should we have health care vouchers, the way that we have school vouchers, et cetera, et cetera? And so those debates don't actually center so much on the body as they do about how do we best organize a series of incentives to get there. The only other thing that I could think of that might have been relevant for speaking, but it's not as relevant today, would have been just war theory, debates about targeting non-combatants. But within the Catholic Church, this is a well-settled issue. You can't target the bodies of non-combatants. You can't torture people. At one point, this was a contentious issue within the United States, but today it's largely not. So where I did want to focus is, well, what are those political public policy questions where the body is actually at the center of the disagreement, where there really is a divide, and the divide isn't over, how best do we accomplish a shared goal, serving public health, serving healthcare, serving migrant populations, but the disagreement is actually whether or not the body matters. And it strikes me that there are three large areas that this plays out in our politics and in our policy debates. It's the beginning and end of life, so the value of the human body at the beginning of life, at the end of life. It's the body and human sexuality, particularly the body and marriage. And then it's the body and what people refer to as gender identity, though I think a more accurate term would be sexual identity. And so that's what I want to spend the time this afternoon speaking on. I will hopefully speak 10 or 15 minutes on each of those topics, and then if I save time, there'll be some time for questions and answers at the end. I'll just preface this by saying I wrote a chapter for one of the Word on Fire books on the new apologetics, and it really highlights these series of questions and how dualism is at the heart of each of them. So if you're in the mood for book purchasing, I don't know if they're selling the Word on Fire book here at the conference, but I'm sure you can get it from the Word on Fire website, and it's their volume on the new apologetics. And then if you really want the long versions of these things, I've written 2 books on marriage, a book on the transgender issue, a book on the abortion debate, and then I'm currently working on a book on assisted suicide. And I think that's where these issues are heading. So all right, let me start with the life question. You see how this policy issue, actually, last thing I should say is that in 45 minutes, I'm not going to be able to give you, all of the arguments so much as I want to give you the shape of the arguments. I want to kind of help you see the contours of the debate and what's at stake in the debate and what some of our opponents might say and what the shape of our response should look like and why it matters. But there won't be enough time in one 45-minute talk to actually go through each and every argument, counter-argument, point by point. So it's going to be a little bit more big picture. All right, so the first is about life. And I want to start with the beginning of life, because here's where you'll see that for a certain type of rejection of the sanctity of life or the dignity of life, a certain type of pro-choice viewpoint, the argument here is that it's just a clump of cells, right? It's not actually a baby. A more sophisticated version of this might be, well, we don't know when life begins. even though if you read any embryology textbook, any developmental biology textbooks, we actually have a fairly clear understanding of when life begins. Right? So you don't actually need an advanced degree in biology or embryology, or let alone a medical degree, to understand that the child in the womb is a separate body from the mother. Most of us, when we announce a pregnancy in modern times, we might be texting an ultrasound picture to our brothers and sisters, to our mom and dad, the grandparents of that child. We've gone in now for 8 ultrasounds, so it's 4 children. You have the 12-week ultrasound, the 20-week ultrasound. Never once has the ultrasound technician referred to our clump of cells. Never once has the ultrasound technician referred to our fetus. Never once has the ultrasound technician said, that's the cardiac electric pulsation of your fetus. Right? Each and every time they said, this is your baby, that's your baby's heartbeat, this is your baby's face, this is the baby butt. Especially early on, the first ultrasound, I had no idea what it was that I was looking at. And so she helps orient, that's the face, that's the butt, those are the legs. Right? We all know what the entity in the womb is when we're excited about it, when we're happy about it. Right? There's no real discussion or debate about who or what that entity is. It has its own integration, its own body plan, its own way of organizing itself, which is distinct from my wife's body plan, from my wife's bodily organization. It's a distinct organism. It's not a part of my wife's body, the way that her eggs are, the way that the sperm are a part of my body. Right? Both sperm and egg are both genetically and functionally parts of the prospective parents' bodies, but that new one-cell zygote, a distinct genome from either the mom or a dad, a distinct trajectory, a distinct growth pattern, it's not a part of either the mother nor the father, and it's a distinct, complete whole, even at that one-cell stage. So much so that what you could think is that none of you were ever a sperm or an egg, but all of you were once a zygote. You were once a blastocyst, you were once an embryo, you were once a fetus, you were once a newborn, a toddler, you were once attending the Word on Fire conference. Right? I didn't just describe a dozen different organisms or a dozen different entities. I described one single organism throughout a dozen different stages of life, or another way of putting this, a dozen different ages. But if you keep going back and back and back looking at your pictures, you would never say, I was that sperm cell, I was that egg cell. Right? Those are both genetically and operationally distinct entities, and they're parts of the parents. Okay, why do I mention this? Simply because I think that is that is the most kind of like flat-footed argument that you will hear. When I was an undergrad at Princeton, the more sophisticated argument, it came from the university's chair, the professor of human values, Peter Singer. Oh boy is the correct response to that. Because Singer is not stupid. And Peter Singer fully understood that that child in the womb is a human being. What he denied was that it was a human person. And so he was willing to say, yes, it's a human being, but no, it doesn't have a right to life. I don't think the sanctity of life view makes sense. I don't think the dignity of life view. The strongest version of this argument is that, yes, that's a human being, but I was never that unborn child because I'm something different than the physical body. Right? So this is a very strong form of metaphysical dualism in which the me is the center of self-consciousness, the center of awareness. It's the higher mental faculties and thoughts, whereas my body is just a costume. It's just a vehicle. And so until I'm able of engaging in self-reflective thoughts, the capability of having language, self-awareness, et cetera, so the argument goes, I don't actually have any moral status. I might be a human being, but I'm not a human person. And the personhood debates are about when does the life of an individual, the life of a person come into existence. And that may be 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 24 months after conception. Right? So Singer, the logical conclusion of his argument is that infanticide is morally acceptable. And there's a famous bioethicist, Michael Tooley, who wrote an essay titled Abortion and Infanticide. And the conclusion of his argument is that up until about 2 years after birth, there's nothing morally wrong with infanticide. Because even though it's a human body, it's not a human person, because the person is something different than the body. All right, last thing I'll say about this, because I don't want, I can give you, I think Bishop Barron yesterday gave you the rebuttal to dualism, so I don't want to repeat all of that. But there's a different type of argument here that I think most people don't buy into the Peter Singer argument. They don't think that like I'm something different than my body. They understand that we are embodied beings. They also don't buy into that it's just a clump of cells because they've seen ultrasound imagery. I think many people are embracing a third type of argument, which is it just isn't valuable enough for me to sacrifice on its behalf. And I think this, I very rarely quote Bill Maher, but on this occasion I will. It was about 3 weeks ago that Bill Maher said the quiet part out loud. And he said that, I'll read you the quote, because his audience, there was a studio audience, there were a couple other guests, they were kind of shocked that he said this so bluntly. He says, quote, "They think it's murder, and it kind of is. I'm just okay with that." I think that what has happened, particularly in the United States, over the 49 and a half years that Roe v. Wade was the precedent that governed our constitutional interpretation at the Supreme Court, is that people have built up their lifestyles, their ways of life, their education, their workplace environment, our economy, et cetera, and for that matter, their sexual lives, on the assumption that abortion is going to be available as emergency contraception. And I think so long as that's the case, it's not primarily an argument about, we don't know when life begins, or, I'm a different entity from my body, like I'm a self, but my body is not me. I don't think those are the arguments that are actually persuading people. I think those are the arguments that intellectuals make to try to justify something that they want. And the reason they want it is because they want to be able to have sex without consequences. And so just to share two last thoughts on this. When people say, are you in favor of the exceptions? Over and over again, we've been hearing President Trump say that he's in favor of the exceptions. And, the standard three that you'll hear will be like rape, incest, life of the mother. I think in many people's hearts of hearts, there's a fourth exception, right? It's rape, incest, life of the mother, and my situation, or my girlfriend's situation, or my daughter's situation, or my wife's situation if we thought we were done having children and then we had an oopsie. Right? And I think that's what's motivating a lot of the public policy challenge. We've lost every ballot initiative since the Dobbs decision. Abortion has been on the ballot 7 times since Dobbs, and we've lost each and every one. And I think the reason why is that now people have skin in the game. Before, so long as Roe was the law of the land, people could say abstractly, oh yeah, I'm pro-life, I'm against killing babies, but they knew that if they ever needed to, should a worst case scenario come by, avail themselves of abortion, it would be legally available. 2 statistics to share. Who gets an abortion and who gets aborted. 4% of babies conceived inside of marriage will be aborted, compared to 40% of babies conceived outside of marriage. Of women who go to get an abortion, only 14% of them are married. 86% of women who have an abortion are unmarried. When you look at those 2 statistics, a 4% compared to a 40% of who gets aborted, and then 14 compared to 86 of who has an abortion, marriage is actually the best protector of unborn human life. Right? Children who are conceived inside of marriage, women who conceive inside of marriage, those children, those mothers have the support structure, the family. It's the best protection. So to my mind, so long as non-marital sex is expected, people will think they need abortion. And so part of the work of the pro-life cause, part of the work of public policy on this question is not so much persuading people of the humanity of the unborn or the personhood of the unborn. It's persuading people to be willing to make the personal sacrifices required to respect the unborn. Let me say a little bit about assisted suicide. I'm looking at the clock, so I need to move more quickly. But the reason that the current book that I'm researching and writing is on assisted suicide is that I think this is the next big question that is coming to the United States, and I think we're largely unprepared for it. You look at what is happening in Western European countries, many of which are increasingly post-Christian countries. Look at what's happening in Canada, and it's just horrific. That what gets sold to the general public as something that will happen in very rare circumstances with lots of various safeguards becomes routinized, and it becomes expected. I think too many people, especially in the States, have bought into an ideology that has a certain logic, which is consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. In the sexual context, it's consenting adults should do sexually whatever consenting adults want to do sexually, and that gives you the hookup culture, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the same thing is going to apply here in the killing context. Right? Why can't we have free markets in killing? If I want to die and my doctor wants to help me die a painless death with dignity, why not just have a free market exchange? And I think there are going to be a lot of people who are too easily susceptible to that argument. So I want to read you one quote from Cardinal Ratzinger. This is from a Lenten homily that he gave in 1981. He says, "Human life stands under God's special protection because each human being, however wretched or exalted he or she may be, however sick or suffering, however good for nothing or important, whether born or unborn, whether incurably ill or radiant with health, each one bears God's breath in himself or herself. Each one is God's image. This is the deepest reason for the inviolability of human dignity, and upon it is founded ultimately every civilization." So I think Ratzinger is entirely correct about that as the deepest theological reason, both for the beginning of life debates and the end of life debates. It's precisely because we're made in the image and likeness of God, whether we're radiant with health or whether we're incurably ill, whether we're very productive for the economy or whether we're good for nothing, right? All those various oppositions he was highlighting. I want to give you 3 additional reasons to think about what's coming with assisted suicide. Beyond the fact that every instance of suicide, doctor-assisted suicide, doctor killing, denies that intrinsic dignity of the human being, violates the Imago Dei. I want to give you 3 additional ways of thinking about what the ecological effects will be, how legalizing assisted suicide would actually transform our culture. And the first is that who are the people most likely to be victimized by this? It's not going to be upper middle class people who attend the Word on Fire conference. It's going to be people who are at the peripheries of life, people who are already marginalized in our society. It's going to be people with disabilities who already lack access to adequate health care, who already are viewed by the general public as if their lives are less worthy of life. You look at all the public opinion polling on how people who don't have disabilities view people with disabilities, and it all shows that we underestimate the value and the worth of people with disabilities. It's going to be people who are aging, the elderly. It's going to be all of our grandparents. It's going to be the intersection of people with disabilities and people who are aging, people experiencing Alzheimer's, the onset of dementia. It's going to be people who lack robust networks of caregiving, otherwise known as the family. It's going to be a variety of people who are already pushed to the periphery, pushed to the margins. And then assisted suicide is going to say, well, look, we have a solution for your problems. All right, so that's one set of concerns. Actually, yeah, for now, that'll be just all I want to say on that. Second, it's going to corrupt the practice of medicine. Think about what it will do to your doctor's own heart if your doctor now knows that he or she has the option of either healing you or killing you. And there's a reason why we have professional codes of ethics. Professionals, think about that. Where does the verb to profess comes from? It comes from religious vows. Think about when people take their solemn profession, they make their solemn profession of vows. And you could think that religious professionals, the religious, what they hold themselves to is a certain ideal of the divine. Professors, academics, certain ideals about the truth. Lawyers, another one of the professions about justice. Well, doctors, what do they profess? They profess healing and wholeness. Right? The heart of medicine isn't a choose your own adventure where your patient is your customer and the customer is always right and you just give your customer whatever he or she demands of you. Medicine is a profession in which they're actually devoted to certain things. The way that religious are devoted to the divine, lawyers to justice, academics to the truth, doctors to healing. And so it will change the practice of medicine. It'll change your relationship with your doctor. Right? So imagine that you're growing old. Imagine that you suffer a variety of disabilities. Imagine that you're starting to have Alzheimer's. How much can you share with your doctor about your struggles? How much can you open up with your doctor? How well will you sleep at night when someone comes in your hospital room and puts something into your IV drip and you don't remember requesting it? right? It'll change the entire way that we interact with our doctors. And this is particularly important because the doctor-patient relationship is asymmetrical. And what I mean by that is when you go to the doctor, unless you yourself are a doctor, the doctor has all the knowledge, you don't. You open up to the doctor about your afflictions and struggles. The doctor doesn't then reciprocate and share with you, his or her struggles. When you go to the doctor, you disrobe, and hopefully your doctor doesn't disrobe. And as a result, when you think about those three areas, this is why in general ethics, lying is wrong, inappropriate touching is wrong, and killing is wrong. It's even worse when the doctor does it. If the doctor lies to you or deceives you or doesn't allow you to have informed consent for treatments, if the doctor touches you inappropriately, if the doctor kills you. Right? There's a reason why we need to have certain safeguards to the practice of medicine, precisely so patients can then have trust in their doctors. Right? And this is going to fall by the wayside. And then third thing I want to say is what it will do to family relationships. All of human life, particularly bodily life, is about shouldering one another's burdens. Right? It's a giant lie, the image of the autonomous, atomistic individual. Right? We're all connected to each other. We're all built into webs of relationships, call them families, and we all enter life entirely dependent on other people. Right? I've been there at 4 childbirths. They come into the world entirely dependent, first for 9 months inside of my wife's body, and then they're still dependent on us. And none of them have gotten to a stage of independence at this point. But then something else is going to happen. At a certain stage in life, my wife and I are going to be dependent on them. And the entire arc of our lives, being wholly dependent on our moms and dads, middle age being dependent on each other, and then at the twilight of our life, depending on our children and our grandchildren. What assisted suicide will do is actually say, well, no, once you've reached a certain age, you don't want to burden your loved ones, right? Gil Meilander wrote a great essay in First Things about 2 decades ago now, titled, "I Want to Burden My Loved Ones," and saying that's the point of loved ones. It's to burden them and it's to shoulder each other's burdens. Think about what normalizing assisted suicide will do to the way that my mom and dad think about themselves as they age. Think about how it will view how I view them. Why are they being so selfish? Why won't they just take the assisted suicide pill? Right? It's going to transform how we think about intergenerational solidarity and how we think about family relationships. Okay, I've gone too long, so I want to keep moving. Second area that I wanted to discuss is marriage. And marriage in its totality. I mean, I think most recently, the marriage debates that we've had in the United States were primarily focused on the definition of marriage. Right? Should it be a same-sex union or just an opposite-sex union? And the arguments that we heard was that, look, the plumbing doesn't matter. Love equals love. I'm in favor of marriage equality. The vision that they gave of marriage, where love equals love, marriage equality, the plumbing, quote, doesn't matter, was based upon a dualistic understanding of the human person, right? That what's happening in marriage, it's a union of hearts and minds. The bodies don't really unite. The plumbing doesn't matter. How we express our care and devotion and affection for each other doesn't matter. The real self is the psyche. It's the center of intellectual acts, volitional acts, loving acts. The body is just how we give expression to this. Now, this played out most recently with the Obergefell decision. It played out at the Supreme Court. But realize that for 2 generations prior to the advent of same-sex marriage, many heterosexuals bought into this vision. Right? The vision that we got out of the sexual revolution was, once again, consenting adults should do sexually whatever consenting adults want to do sexually. Right? And so the way that we had lived for 2 generations was that monogamy didn't matter, exclusivity didn't matter, and that permanency didn't matter. And what do I mean by this? I mean, the hookup culture, the normalization of cohabitation, the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, the more than doubling in our rates of divorce, the growth from 4% of all Americans to 40% of all Americans being born outside of marriage. Right? Gay marriage didn't create any of those problems. Right? All of those problems were the result of heterosexuals not taking monogamy, exclusivity, or permanence seriously. And now I think what we saw with the Supreme Court was Anthony Kennedy and the 4 other liberal justices says, well, why should we take sexual complementarity seriously either? Right? Why take the body seriously if we've ignored all the other implications of the body? Right? Because part of a sound understanding of marriage is that the two become one flesh, to use the biblical language. And that's not merely poetical, metaphorical. At a very real physical and metaphysical level, when a man and a woman unite in a conjugal action, they form one flesh, they form one body. So much so that 9 months later it might require a name. And that tells us something, that the lovemaking action, the action that unifies a man and a woman as husband and wife, is the very same action that might make them mother and father. That the lovemaking act is also the life-giving act. This is where you'll sometimes hear Catholics talk about, what are the 2 ends of marriage, right? It's both the unity of the spouses and the procreation of children. And it's baked right into the very same action, that the marital action is also a procreative type action, it's a reproductive act, a conjugal act, et cetera, et cetera. That then, the way that my co-authors and I in our book on marriage put this is to say that it's a comprehensive union. You unite comprehensively with another person. It's not just a union of hearts and minds, right? That's what friendship is, right? You unite comprehensively with another person when you unite at all levels of your humanity. And precisely because we are bodily people, to unite comprehensively with another person would require not just a union of hearts and minds, but hearts, minds, and bodies. And if it's a comprehensive union, that comprehensive union is going to be not just at any moment in time, but it's going to be throughout time. That's why we take a vow of till death do us part. And it's going to be at every moment in time. Right? That's why any exclusivity that marriage calls for is bodily, sexual exclusivity. Right? Because of the type of action. None of you are cheating on your spouses if you're at this conference without your spouse. But if you were to sleep with someone other than your spouse, you would be cheating on your spouse, because it's that bodily activity, that sexual activity that transforms other ordinary relationships of hearts and minds into the marital domain. This would also explain when you think about the action that unifies a man and a woman as one flesh, what it's ordered towards with the creation of new life, and then the requirements that it calls forth from us, permanency and exclusivity. This would explain why the Catholic Church speaks out against both contraception and IVF, and it's grounded in the natural law, right? The contraception actually blocks a 2-in-1 flesh union. IVF separates the procreation of children that transcend as a gift upon marital union and turns them into an object of technical manufacturing. Right? So the deepest reason why the church speaks out against severing or attempting to sever the unitive from the procreative is actually if you try to do one without the other, you don't get either. Right? It's only when the act that spouses engage in is open to life that it actually unifies them. And it's only when new human beings are brought into existence as an act of love that we don't instrumentalize those people. Last thing I'll say on marriage is that parenting matters, but there's also no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and fathering, right? So when you think about like the body on this, like why should we have laws that not only define marriage accurately, but also then incentivize and encourage marriage? It's precisely so that children would then have the gift of their married mother and father committed to each other and then also committed to them. When you look at all the social science, and I'll read you one quote, we know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents, and the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. That wasn't Cardinal Ratzinger. The first quote was from Ratzinger. That was Barack Obama. Right? And President Obama, before he evolved on the marriage question, he understood the importance of marriage because he grew up without his father. And so it was at a commencement address that he gave a few years after this speech where he said, I've tried to be for Michelle and my daughters what my father wasn't for me. Right? So part of the reason why we have government in the marriage business, but we don't have government in the baptism business, we don't have government in the bar mitzvah business, the confirmation business, government, both church and state, are in the marriage business because marriage does double duty. right? It's both a sacrament, it has a sacred aspect, it's also a natural institution, it's a public institution, and it's meant to channel men and women to each other in a permanent and exclusive commitment, so that any children that that union produces then has the gift of both a mother and a father, right? That's the public policy reason for why the state's even in the marriage business. We don't have a best friend registry, right? So why is the state's not in the best friend business? Why is it in the marriage business if it's not ultimately about marriage being generative and creating the next generation? All right, last thing I want to say, and the time I have left, is the debates that in the public square go by gender identity. I think much better to think about this as sexual identity. But you'll see at the root of these debates is also a form of dualism. Right? So dualism underlies our life debates. Just a clump of cells. It's a human being, but it's not a human person. Grandma's dementia is so far gone that she's just a vegetable. Right? Think about how we dehumanize people in dualistic language in the life debates. Think about how we do it in the marriage debates. Well, it's just sex. The plumbing doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything, right? There's nothing intrinsic, no intrinsic meaning to the body when it comes to our sexuality, which then leads to this third area where, look, the real self is my inner sense of self. It's my inner gender identity. It's how I identify as a boy or a girl or both or neither or somewhere in between. And then my body is just a costume. It's just a vehicle for how I give expression to the real me, right? The inner truth of who I am. Right? So in this understanding, gender is utterly distinct from so-called sex assigned at birth. Gender exists along a spectrum, a variety of possibilities in between, and gender can be fluid, where you could be more on the male end of the spectrum one day, more on the female end of the spectrum the next day, or over the course of years, right? The fluidity need not be day to day, but it could be month to month, year to year, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting about this form of dualism is that the theories of it are internally incoherent. They're contradictory because on one hand, everyone has a true gender identity that we discover. And we have to look inward and we feel like a woman, or we feel like a man, or we feel like both, we feel like neither. And I have no idea what it feels like to feel like a woman. I don't think my wife knows what it feels like. She knows what it's like to be a woman. But when I ask her, like, there's not a feeling that is attached, and like not every woman in this ballroom has the same set of feelings. That's not what makes you a woman. But so that's one theory here, is that we each have this deep-seated, and we have to discover it. The other is the performative theory of gender, where each of us we have to perform it. It's something that we choose. It's something that we declare. We couldn't get it wrong because there's no truth out there to be discovered. Truth is something that we make. And somehow the ideology here oscillates between one or the other, that there's something out there that we discover versus there's something that we as autonomous self-creators decide for ourselves. But what they both have in common is that the body is irrelevant. There is no intrinsic meaning or purpose to my embodiment as male if it conflicts with my inner desires or my inner feelings when it comes to my identity. All right, so let me say a little bit about this. And the very first thing to say is that dualism, that the real me is something other than the body, is simply false. Right? No one could be, quote, trapped in the wrong body because we're not in a body, we are a body. Right? This is the Aristotelian insight, the Catholic insight, that we're embodied beings. We're incarnate beings. And so if that's the case, then stop thinking of the language of gender and just think about, well, what is the sexual identity of the body? If I'm an embodied being and I'm a sexual being, why do we say that the sexual binary is a binary and stable? Because there are two ways of being sexually organized with respect to sexual reproduction. Right? There's a male way of being organized. There's a female way of being organized. There's not a spectrum between the two, although there are disorders of sexual development. And if you've been watching the Olympics in the past week, you will know that there's a case right now of a male athlete who has a disorder of sexual development and so was competing as a female. That has nothing to do with transgender ideology. That just has to do with how we diagnose and treat disorders of sexual development. But there's not a spectrum between male and female. It's not fluid where one day your body is organized a male way, one day a female way. Why do I say it's binary and stable? What I mean by this is that there are two sets of sex cells. There are two gametes. There are two genitals. There are two reproductive organs. There are two reproductive systems. There's not a third genital, there's not a third gamete, there's not a third reproductive organ, a third reproductive system. There's not some hybrid or some spectrum between these two, although there are people who are incompletely developed with one or the other. Why does this matter for policy? I have 7.5 minutes left, and I want to give you 8 reasons. So I'll say 1 minute on each. Privacy, safety, equality, liberty, family, bodily integrity, ideology, and spirituality. Why this matters for policy is first privacy. There's a reason why we no longer have separate water fountains or bathrooms for black and white, but we do have separate bathrooms for male and female. Right? Our bodily differences make a difference when we're in a state of undress, when we're performing intimate bodily functions. Our skin color is irrelevant. That privacy gets heightened in those areas where there's also a safety concern. I live in Loudoun County, Virginia, and there are 2 different middle school girls who were sexually assaulted in the school bathroom by a boy identifying as a girl. Right? The vast majority of sex crimes are perpetrated by men. The vast majority of sex crime victims are women. There's a reason why we separate male and female when we're in states of undress or performing intimate bodily functions, precisely not just for the privacy aspect, but also for the safety aspect. Same thing is true for athletic competition, right? So if you were watching the Olympics, the reason the Italian boxer dropped out of that boxing match was it was unsafe, right? When male and female bodies are colliding, there are biological differences that make a difference. Third area was equality. Leave aside boxing, swimming competition. Right? There's a reason why we have separate male and female athletic competitions, and thank God we no longer have separate black and white sports leagues. Right? We once had the Negro League and Major League Baseball, and we had separate baseball leagues based upon skin color. Right? That was just unjust. It was racism. It was a result of white supremacy. But respecting women's equality didn't create the intergender basketball association. It created the NBA and the WNBA, right? And so sometimes actually like respecting equality doesn't mean treating everyone the same, but it means taking account for the differences that make a difference. Physical competition is one of those areas. So take swimming, take track. Even if there's no safety risk because bodies aren't colliding, it's still unfair for all of those Ivy League swimmers who missed out on a chance of winning a championship because there was a boy identifying as a girl in those championship races. Right? Leah Thomas was a mediocre male swimmer, was ranked in the mid-400s freshman, sophomore, junior year, and then all of a sudden senior year is a gold champion. So there are equality concerns. Fourth are liberty concerns, public policy on this. There are people who have lost their jobs because they wouldn't give in to gender ideology. People who wouldn't speak false pronouns, teachers, college professors, in one case a medical professor, who have all been disciplined, fired, lost their jobs, are still at various stages of litigation over this. There are 21 states where if you're a parent of a child with gender dysphoria, you can't get a medical professional to help you and your child feel comfortable in his or her own body because the state says that this is conversion therapy. And so by that, if you have a biological girl who feels uncomfortable as a girl and you try to help her feel comfortable, you're converting her. But if you give her puberty blocking drugs, testosterone, a double mastectomy, you're affirming her. Right? So this is an Orwellian situation in which actual conversion, the puberty blockers, the cross-sex hormones, the surgery, is called affirmation. And actual affirmation, affirming the person in the reality of his or her body, is called conversion. And so in 21 states, a doctor could lose his or her medical license for practicing medicine the way it ought to be practiced because the state says it's illegal. And by contrast, there are, and there was just repromulgated by the Biden administration, healthcare mandates that would say that if you're a medical doctor and you perform a mastectomy in the case of breast cancer, you also have to perform it in the case of someone who wants to transition. And there are Catholic hospitals who have been sued for not performing those surgeries. So there are liberty concerns. Fifth, there are family concerns, and these family concerns come in 2 contexts. One is when someone transitions, it can tear families apart, whether it's a child transitioning or an adult transitioning. And you saw some of this when Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner, And some of the children said they felt like they were, it was one of the daughters said she felt like she was losing her father. And then she kind of got attacked on Twitter and other social media for being transphobic and for not being accepting of her father's truth as now being a woman. When children transition and other siblings, some of them think it's a good idea, some of them think it's a bad idea, can very much alienate, tear families apart. But the most tragic family situations that I've been involved with happen with parents who went along with the transition early on because they didn't know any better. Especially back when I first wrote my book came out in February of 2018. And for people who were transitioning in those early 2010s, this really wasn't talked much on TV news. And if you were a good parent who loved your child and your child has a problem and you go to the best doctor you can find, which is frequently at the university hospital in the big city nearest to where you live, and the person in the white lab coat says, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter? And they say, put your child on this puberty blocking drug or this testosterone because otherwise your daughter is going to commit suicide, and wouldn't you rather have a living son than a dead daughter? Many parents get emotionally blackmailed into doing this. And then 5 or 10 years later, when the parents realize what a mistake they made, they're just distraught, they're besides themselves. And I've sat with many parents in that situation, and they're showing me pictures of what their child used to look like, what the child now looks like, and those are the second most tragic stories, because the next area of concern is with person. I mean, the biggest public policy victims here are not the athletes. It's not people whose either privacy or safety have been violated, or the equality for concerns. It's the children themselves whose bodies have been mutilated. Children themselves who have been lied to by adults, that they're trapped in the wrong body, or that their gender identity is somehow different than their bodily reality. Children who have been placed on puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, have had surgery. All of our tax dollars have paid for double mastectomies on 13-year-old girls. This is a part of an NIH study in which they revealed all of the data, and there were 2 13-year-old participants that had chest surgery, and they were female to male transitioners. We now have a small cohort, predominantly females in their late teens and early 20s, who are suing the doctors, the hospitals, the healthcare systems that have done this to them. And when you hear their testimonies, they're just incredibly heartbreaking, right? Because no young person is mature enough to know at age 13 what it's going to mean to start taking testosterone, at age 15 to have a double mastectomy, and then when they're 18, 19, 20, second to last concern was ideology. We should all care what's being taught as truth to our nation's children. Even if you have the resources to homeschool or to send your kids to a good Catholic school, part of good citizenship is caring about what our neighbors' children are being indoctrinated with. And at too many of our government-run schools, the gender unicorn, the gender-bred person, are being used to catechize students, to teach students that this is the truth about their bodies, their identities, that gender is fluid, that gender exists along a spectrum, that sex was merely assigned at birth, that sex could be reassigned later in life. And this is going to change how an entire cohort, an entire generation of young people comes to think about themselves, comes to think about their bodily reality. And the last one is, I said spirituality. I don't actually like that word. I like telling people I'm religious but not spiritual, but all the others ended in a Y, so I wanted to keep it with a Y. But the catechism of the gender unicorn and the gender-bred person is fundamentally, diametrically opposed to the catechism of the Catholic Church. And there are going to be huge evangelistic roadblocks that gender ideology poses. Many people are leaving the church because they think the church doesn't teach the truth, is anti-scientific. And so it's going to create challenges for us. But even at a deeper level, for people who have been victimized by the ideology, there are going to be all sorts of spiritual, pastoral care that they need. And in talking with people who have transitioned and detransitioned, imagine, this is not like, when I was in high school, people would go goth. They might paint their fingernails black, they might wear a black trench coat. And then a year or two later, they grew out of it and they kind of looked back and laughed and said, oh, that was a funny stage that I went through. imagine the amount of kind of like regret and embarrassment and loathing for someone who was like, wait, I convinced my parents that I wanted to transition. I convinced them of this. They blame themselves frequently, even though they were victimized by the doctors, by the counselors, et cetera, et cetera. And there's going to be, I think there's a huge need, what the Courage Ministry has done for the Catholic Church for people with same-sex attractions. There's going to be ministries, expertise needed for ministering to people who have struggled with gender dysphoria. All right, and so I'm out of time. Let me just wrap up by saying, in all three of these areas that I've mentioned, beginning and end of life, marriage, gender ideology, what the church teaches is true. And it's true not just as a matter of revelation. I mean, these are three truths that are revealed in the first page of the Bible, that were made in the image and likeness of God, that were created male and female, and that men and women are created for each other in marriage. I mean, this is like right on the first page of the Bible. But this is also what the best of philosophy reveals. This is what the best of science, the best of social science, the best of psychological sciences, over and over and over again, all of the best studies we have, whether it's on embryology, whether it's on palliative care, whether it's on social science of parenting, whether it's on psychological sciences on transitioning, there's no conflict between faith and reason. And these three truths, they lead to happiness, they lead to flourishing. And so I just want to close by encouraging you, whatever kind of like walk of life you're in, to do whatever you can to bear witness to these truths. None of them are going to be solved during the next election, right? Even though this talk was on public policy. It's not going to be solved with November's election. It's not going to be solved in the next administration. These are going to be generational questions. My children, my great-grandchildren. And so the work that we need to do very much needs to be playing the long game. So thank you.